Earlier this morning I said social linguistics is important. We looked at phonological variation and the usage-based approach, how we can model this, how it affects the storage in terms of exemplar clouds leading to more entrenched mesoconstructions. And then I always talked about cognitive factors, processing, end weight, animacy. We talked about metaphor and metonymy in pidgins and creoles. And in talking about pidgins and creoles, I extended it to the dynamic model, different types of contact, different types of varieties, with a tendency to one-to-one form meaning pairings in pidgins and creoles, something that, as I said, other people have argued for, a more analytic kind of use in these varieties. And I said from a construction grammar point of view, we can see the advantage of that. One form, one meaning, close association, probably easier to pass. So we've come to this, where we've got to talk about football, and where Alex and I talked about football, because I love football. He doesn't mind it, but he's not such a huge fan as I. But when we first talked about this, it was in a completely different context. And we talked a bit more about social linguistics and construction grammar, context and construction grammar. And then I said, football chants are really interesting in terms of social identity, who does it, what you got to do, you got to wear a shirt, you got to go to a stadium. It's important who sings it, that you know the songs, you got to learn them. They're bigger than words, they're definitely constructions. As you will see, some of them are creative. Let's do something on construction grammar with it. And the longer we thought about it, you can see comparative correlatives still haunt me, the more we came to the conclusion this is also pointing to another direction, to perhaps something which has to do with how linguistic genres arise, how that we might have to say at least an interesting idea to cognitive poetics and lots of other fields. So even if you don't like football, hopefully I'll be able to show you that it touches upon many issues which are also going to be important in, from a social linguistic point of view, from a cognitive social linguistic point of view, and for construction grammar in general. So we're looking at football chants as constructions. How all of this ties in with cognitive poetics. There we draw on schema theory, which is well known, that if you think about it, you've got a mental representation of knowledge. If you've ever traveled by plane, you know that you can expect certain things. If you've done it once, then you've got a very specific exemplar. Just like we said with the entrenchment of constructions, if you've traveled very often, you will know you can get the ticket. Nowadays, you can print it out online. You go there. There's a security check. You go to your gate. You wait. You're being called up. You sit down. There's a flight attendant going down the aisle, checking that you've buckled your seatbelt. Then there's safety instructions, which no one ever listens to anymore. It's always the same thing, okay? There's like a little movie that you can expect, a script. And conference talk for us as linguists, that's the same thing. You go somewhere, you need to register, you get a funky badge that always turns around and no one can read. You forget the badge, that kind of thing. You do the talk, and if it's scheduled late at night, no one's going to pop up, that kind of thing. You learn this from experience with prototype and frequency effects, just like we said, you learn about constructions. And you obviously schematize, because you get slots for participants and places, because some lovely conferences take place in Vigo, and others take place in in other places where it's not so nice, right? Go to London or New York or whatever, or some other horrid places. You get a hierarchical structure, so the specific instances will be exemplars, and you get meso-constructions in a way. For, phonology conferences might work different from syntactic conferences. And Stockwell said literary genres, crime novels, detective novels, romantic novels, fictional episodes, imagined characters and narrated situations can all be understood as part of schematized knowledge negotiation. And one of the key factors in the appeal of schema theory is that it sees knowledge structures as dynamic and experientially developing. And the question is, of course, where do babies get their schemas from? And which level of a schema is used in a particular situation, whether you watch a play and you think about it as just Macbeth, as a Shakespeare play, or as a court politics drama. Okay? That's the same kind of level of schematization whether you think the more you eat, the fatter you get, or you're talking about a microconstruction, or you think about the more mesoconstruction, or are you thinking about the comparative phrase, abstract construction. And so what this to us implies is that genre, something like a detective novel and something like a novel in general, what people cognitively have is exactly that, micro, meso, and macro constructions. And we're not talking about literary genres in the sense of what literary scholars would say a romantic novel has to be like, or what a Shakespeare drama is like, but what individuals, lay people, experience by usage and what they come up with. And of course, if you read lots of detective novels, you're going to have a more abstract schema for those. Okay? If you only read a specific kind of writer, Ian Rankin, those are pretty good. And if you've only got Rebus as the detective, then you're not going to schematize that slot. Okay? You're going to have a very idea that a detective novel by Rankin is going to be Rebus solving cases. If you read Agatha Christie and others, you know there's a detective or a type of detective slot doing these kind of things. Okay? Again, bottom up, experientially based. The wider you read, the more different types you have, the more of an abstract schema you're going to get. And you're going to have prototype effects and all of this. And this is where we think that constructions perhaps can be taken beyond syntax. Okay? Where even something like a genre, what you conceive to be a romantic poem, what you think of when I say political drama or rom-com movie, okay? In the same kind of way is a form that you expect with slots, and you associate a certain meaning with it. For many of these things, meaning might also be more connotations, associative, you know, how much you like it, that it's a very positive story, that it's negative, or that kind of thing, that the good ends happily and the bad unhappily, that kind of thing, something very abstract. But still full meaning pairings. And something that Alex and I have been toying around with for some time is the idea, how much can we use constructions to go beyond sentences? Okay. So football charts. We said that they can be easily analyzed as constructions, mental full meaning pairings. And that's also something that we think is important for so many other pragmatic constructions and social linguistic constructions. They've got very specific context-dependent constraints. In order to use them correctly, like a greeting, you've got to be using them at the right kind of time and addressing them to the right kind of people. So they're addressee-directed. They establish an identity. Okay? You do that because you want to show, I'm a supporter of that club. You identify with a group of people who are also supporting that club. That's why you buy the shirts, you all go to the stadium together, and you sing those songs together. It's a complex situational constraints of use, how the game goes. Certain chants are only appropriate if you're winning. Some of them are only there if you're 1 goal down or something like that. And they're acquired in an informal, non-educational setting. They're a genre, football chants, and that's also why we took advantage of that. If you think about literature, like poems or novels, people might have got some exposure at school, literary theory, they've got notions where they're sort of tainted with knowledge. But no one has been taught at school how to do a football chant. They learnt it in a usage-based kind of way. You go there and you follow the pack. In a way, it's sort of social linguistics and social linguistic identity condensed into 90 minutes. Okay? If it's your first game, you've got 90 minutes then to just accommodate to it. Oh, sorry, shouldn't have done it. So historically, the first football chant that was used, interestingly, is from the 1960s, 1970s. You'll Never Walk Alone by Gary and the Peacemakers, a very mellow song if you know it. And at Anfield in Liverpool, they still play the song, the music, and the fans sing along. Now, if we think at the start of the game, and they play the song in full and the people sing along, that's not very exciting. That's a song and people sing it along. There are already social linguistic issues at work, however, because you sing along to support your team. It's not just because you like that song, okay? You already express, if you sing along, I'm a fan who knows this ritual, I'm part of the group, we're all together now, we've got a common social linguistic identity. And during the game, when the music isn't on, they also use the chant. They don't sing the full song, it's only this. Walk on with hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone, you'll never walk alone. It's got a definite form, the specific words are fixed, it's got a certain tune, okay? In other linguistic constructions we talk about intonation, that's fixed. And it's got a specific meaning which is not the song anymore, okay? It's got an illocutionary act associated with it, you want to support your team, okay? you sing this song if they're in a difficult situation. You're trailing by a goal, you're not winning, and then you can sing that song because you want to support them. You want to say, don't give up, we're behind you. Okay? And that's an added meaning that you don't have in the song. The song is just about poor guy with ferry, no, not ferry across the Mersey, but you never walk alone. Okay? So that's a new football-specific contextual meaning. Probably not constructionalization in the sense of Traugott and Trousdale, because the form is still pretty similar, but the meaning has definitely changed. That's added new meaning. Now 35 is already more interesting than a simple lyrics idiom, because it requires a multitude of singers. If you do the walk on, it's not enough if you alone sing it. For a successful use, there has to be a ringleader. Not everyone can start a song. That's important. The social setup of the group is important. But other people need to join in. It's a speech act, the appeal to stand firm, that goes beyond the semantics of the song. And in terms of communication psychology, self-revelation, you reveal something about your identity. You're a special type of fan, you're supporting them. It's an expression of a fan block identity, of a group identity. And an identity that goes beyond that with referees in audience design terms of players, club, manager, everyone who's not there, a bigger group, an idealized kind of community. And from an embodied point of view, and lots of work has been done on embodied construction grammar, where having bodies is assumed to have a direct effect on how we think in terms of, for example, containment, that things can be inside or outside stuff, because we've got a body and we feel we're inside and the rest is outside, that kind of thing. And in terms of how this is performed, it's not just singing the song, but it's performance, okay? With respect to, you've got to face the pitch. If you've got a scarf, you've got to have it over your head, you've got to sway, that kind of thing, so that you've got to do more than language. It's multimodal, and that definitely ties into something that Alex will be talking about in Pamplona, multimodal construction grammar, that these things also enter into it, okay? Because you don't just sing it, there's also an action going on. Okay. But you never walk alone, despite the fact that it's interesting. Is sort of limited because it's completely substantive. There are no slots. And now we get to this. So the one that I've got the video for online is Northern Ireland playing Spain. And you were really good at the time, and it was only a friendly, okay? But Northern Ireland won 3-2. And of course the Northern Ireland fans celebrated, and they sang. So what were they singing? Are you England? Are you England? Are you England in disguise? Are you England in disguise? Oh, thank you. Okay, so this. Now think about it. Northern Ireland, Spain, no England. Okay? You immediately got why they were doing it. Okay? You already know what's going on there. And if we go back to the one that I can't play, unfortunately, so that's a football chant, and we can talk about it as a construction. But interestingly, it's one that is more flexible. Liverpool, Arsenal. Arsenal fans sing, "Are you Tottenham? Are you Tottenham? Are you Tottenham in disguise? Are you Tottenham in disguise?" Okay. So that's a very frequent chant to mock a current opponent and abusing your fiercest rival. It's schematic. Okay? You can fill in any kind of personal favorite that you like, and you can also distinguish if you are playing in the Premier League, okay? Then you can use one of the clubs, and if you're playing on a national level, you can insert national teams. Nottingham Forest, and just to show you how creative this is Nottingham Forest fans regularly sing, "Are you Derby, are you Derby, are you Derby in disguise? Are you Derby in disguise?" All of these chants mock the current opponent, okay? By drawing on your most fierce rival, because those are the ones that you really don't like, which is interesting because you refer to a team that's not even there, and not only do you put down your opponent, you also say something about your fiercest rival who aren't there. Okay? And Alex and I have been thinking about how this could have started, and it seems, that originally, obviously, it must have been, in terms of the first microconstruction, a team that is really, really bad, and your opponent. And then it was extended, this kind of association. Oh, the team that goes into this slot is not just a rival, but it's bad. Oh, then I use it to mock my enemies. And extended to teams like Tottenham, who are, okay, they're not that bad. Okay, they're not like Derby. And England, well, they used to be good at the time. Probably easier targets now. So if we think about it, we've got micro-constructions. Are you England? Are you England in disguise? Are you Derby? Are you Andorra? They all follow the same pattern in terms of, you can find that on YouTube. I intend to do that. So you've got a structure, you've got to learn all of this. Okay? Are you football team? That's the slot. And you've got to repeat this. It's not just enough to say, are you football team once? It goes in a certain structure that you can say, are you football team? Are you football team? Are you football team in disguise? And repeat, are you football team in disguise? This goes to the tune of Bread of Heaven. It's a Welsh hymn. I'm not going to pronounce the Welsh, but it means Bread of Heaven. It's a religious song that they tap into, which of course makes sense in a way. You know, we can see why, in terms of a group identity, you refer to something that has also this. You sing it together in church. I know religion is not as important as it used to be, but you can see that it's got a similar association. You as a group identity share this. It needs to be a template with respect to the tune. I can't sing it well, but you know how it goes. Da da dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da 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 da. Okay, you need to memorize this. You need to memorize the intonation, the tune, and this needs to go in the right kind of places. And there are some constructions, the more the merrier. I would argue that there's something like intonation going on. Question constructions, like yes or no constructions in English. Did you do it? You need to go up with the voice. Okay? So again, intonation is going to be part of that construction. So that's why this isn't as outlandish as it might seem. So form on the phonological level is also going to include intonation, and here it's a specific tune that you've got to follow. The semantics is interesting because if you want to break it down into semantics and other meanings, our current opponent plays like team number one that we mention here, and team number one plays very badly. That's a semantic basis for this. The social identity, which we included as a feature, it's not really, whether that's like a normal kind of feature that can unify and complexity in computer simulations, probably not. But it's something that you need to specify, right? This is a construction that's really used to express a feeling of us versus them, social linguistic identity. And this is something that's going to be important not just for football fans and for football groups, but also for if you're upper middle class and you pronounce your R's in New York against sort of lower middle class and you don't do that kind of thing. Okay? So this is not just some football thing. There are usage constraints, just like you've got to say good morning in the morning and not in the evening. This song only works if you're in the lead, if you're doing well. If you are losing, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. And elocution is obviously to abuse, to mock. That's something that football chants very often do. Okay, but micro-constructions leading to a meso-construction, with the RUX in disguise. Now, interestingly, Bread of Heaven, the song that we just had, is also a template for other songs. So if the score changes, the opponents might chant, you're not singing, you're not singing, you're not singing anymore, you're not singing anymore. And loudness is more important than beauty when it comes to football chants, but I'm not going to shout into the microphone. Same kind of song. You also see the parallelism, right? The first line is repeated. That might be like a intonational constraint on the tune, because the tune goes that way and the original song goes similarly. But you've got to repeat this line twice again. And there's also variation there. Okay, based on this, maybe snow-cloned. You get things like you're not ringing, you're not ringing, you're not ringing anymore. That's a specific song because Portsmouth has a very notorious fan with a loud bell that annoys the opponents. And when Arsenal fans were winning 4-1, obviously he didn't have a chance to ring his bell, so they were drawing on this. And Stoke City fans, Chelsea was banned from making any new signings by the UEFA a couple of years back. They sang, you're not signing, you're not signing, you're not signing anymore. So encyclopedic world knowledge is important to get the right kind of stuff in there. You need to know something about football, about signing. But you can see how this template, and as I argued, if the more I think about it, those were probably snow-cloned, can extend. And so now, of course, You're Not Singing is the most frequent prototype of this specific chant, but you get microconstructions exhibiting type variation. So people now have at their disposal also this construction, You're Not, that's specified phonologically anymore, but you put a present participle in here. The semantics is our addressees, the fans of the current opposition, have stopped whatever the verb stands for, singing, signing, ringing. Social identity, always the same, it's us against them. Usage constraint, that's very important. They must have done something, if you think about it encyclopedically, up until now, which they're not doing anymore, only to use this. It's really complex, but all of this needs to be part of the construction. And abuse and mockery, very important in football. Then we thought about looking at Bread of Heaven, what other songs are there? Okay? Can we find something even more macro about it? Because it is a template that football fans draw on very often. You get things like, does your missus know you're here? That was when a footballer allegedly cheated on his wife. Does the circus know you're here? That's about a very lanky, geeky kind of football player, and they mocked him, Peter Crouch, okay? Because, yeah, if you've seen him, you know what I mean. And does your butler know you're here? That was about a footballer who was perceived as very posh, okay? And they work the same with does your missus know you're here? Does your missus know you're here? Same tune, okay? Can we play you every week? That's another one. Shall we buy a ground for you? That was Chelsea fans mocking Arsenal's financial problems in 2004. And the Arsenal fans replied, shall we win the league for you? Because back then Chelsea hadn't won the league in ages. So you see an interactive kind of thing. Alex reminded me of flighting during the early modern English period. In the kind of thing that your mama jokes work in exactly the same kind of way in a situation. You say it, then you've got to say something like your mama, and so on. This is a very informal kind of listing of the different songs, but it gives you 14 different types. Does your, can we play you, shall you, and 7 of these have multiple lexicalizations. They have schematic constructions, mesoconstructions. So what's the most macro that we can safely assume that there is? And the syllables are not that fixed as they are implied here, but because of the tune, because of the song, you know that there's a limited number of segments you can squeeze in. Sometimes in music you can squeeze in more syllables on a single note, so it's obviously flexible, but there are temporal limitations. There is a repetition bit. There is one element that is always schematic. There is a repetition of the first line and a repetition of the second stanza, so to speak, and the second stanza has extra bit which the first one hasn't got. The tune is always Bread of Heaven. So football chants at the back of the mind have Bread of Heaven as well as this very schematic template for putting stuff in there. The semantics is not quite fixed because that's going to be many different things depending on the words that you fill in. But social linguistic identity for all football chants is going to be us against them. It's a marker of social identity. It's a reaction to score an opponent. Most importantly, all of the ones that we found were abuse and mockery. Because if you think about football chants, you can also use a chant to support your team, okay? To celebrate a player, to celebrate the score. But all of the Bread of Heaven ones seem to share the common meaning of we're going to rub it in your face. So we've got microconstructions, like are you in the skies, are you Darwin in the skies, leading to a mesoconstruction. We've got you're not signing, you're not singing, leading to this. And we've got this more abstract category here. Other schematic abuse chants. We then looked at La Donna Mobile. Obviously, the songs need to be well known by a community. They must be deeply entrenched so that people can draw on it. And if you think about it, once you've got the template and you're in a football stadium and people make use of it because you know the tune and you know the repetition pattern, it's easy to sort of jump in the second time around it is sung. Okay? That's also the advantage of the schema. So Your Car's Too Fast to You, sung for Cristiano Ronaldo at Manchester after his accident with his Ferrari, Rigoletto. Your Wife Eats Testicles, directed at Harry Youll after his wife ate testicles as part of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. You Let Your Language Down, Steve McLaren, after a less successful TV interview. He was managing a Dutch team, I think, and it sounded pretty Dutch. Sit Down, Pinocchio, a Liverpool assistant manager with a very prominent nose. Again, I mean, these, for example, very directed at individuals, an individual player, individual manager. and mocking, but some of them are also to their own team, so it's not just necessarily the opponents. You can also mock your own players in a friendly kind of banter way, which is also important in the concept of a layered culture that is embodied by football. Okay, we're jumping right now. So, we've seen these constructions like the bread of heaven construction, there's a La Donna Mobile construction that's used in this situation. And if you think about it, people learn a repertoire of different football songs by going to football matches. So their notion of this genre football chant, because there are many different ones, and you get a wide variety, is going to be based on specific exemplars, but with enough type frequency, you're going to get schemas. In a way, this is unsupervised learning of a genre, right? It's not quite Shakespeare, and it's not quite, I don't know, an Agatha Christie novel, but you have an idea of what a football chant is like because of this, in a bottom-up kind of way. And when we thought about this, we said, well, you know, maybe that's also how lay people entrench notions for other genres. Take this. There's one known. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe, their eyes can see, so long live this, and this give life to thee. Sonnet number 18. English speaking, well, we would argue probably the most famous sonnet of them all. Okay? Now, if you're not a literary scholar, if you're an ordinary kind of person and you vote for the nation's top 100 poems, you're going to know that one. And maybe you know one or two more by Shakespeare. And that gives you an idea, because you've heard it's a sonnet, what a sonnet is like. You might not be able to put it in words, but you can detect the rhythm, the iambic parameter there. You've got 5 stresses in each line, the cross rhymes here, that kind of thing, and that you've got the heroic couplet at the end. Okay, you might not know the names, but if you also think back to oral cultures, and if you memorize this, this is an exemplar, just like Are You England in Disguise? It's of higher literary value. Okay, I'm not going to dispute this, but people learned it in exactly the same kind of way. Now, their notion of poetry will then depend, if they're not literary scholars, on exposure to different exemplars. And if you see more Shakespearean ones, then what you're going to get is exactly this, 14 lines, 3 sets of 4, and the final couplet, and so on. Also, what you're going to get is an association, and that's something that we would strongly argue, I think, Alex and I, of a type of meaning. Perhaps not semantic, you know, but when it comes to art, people always associate an associative, connotative meaning with it. For many people with a Shakespeare sonnet, when would they use it? What kind of feelings would it evoke? What do you associate with sonnet number 18? If you are the poetic type, who would you send the poem to? Yes, love poem, that's what we associate with it. Boyfriend, girlfriend. Now, literary scholars would frown at this and would say, yeah, but Shakespeare wrote this for a guy. Right? That was to a friend, and it wasn't to a mistress. But it's, again, from a usage-based perspective, we would say, yes, for a literary scholar that's really important, but for us it's not. But for us the question is, what kind of meaning do people entrench just by exposure to usage? Okay? So it's not important what it really meant, what Shakespeare intended, but what people do with the poem and how they store it. And they store it as a love poem, and they think that this is a way of expressing love. And this is going to shape their prototype, and very often sonnets of the type are going to be classified as this. 116 is similar, and a Spencer, if you read that, then that's also going to extend your poem section. Oh, I haven't got it. Winfred Owen, isn't it? Yeah. There's also, and I haven't got it, I don't know why, but there is also a sonnet by Winfred Owen written during wartime. What's the title, Alex? Yes, Anthem for a Doomed Youth. And if you read that, it's got the structure of a sonnet, but if you come across it, you're going to go like, but it doesn't quite fit my prototype. It doesn't fit my mesoconstruction, because I associate sonnets with love content, right? And this is about the war and the horrible effects it has, something completely different. There is coercion going on, okay, by using this structure and by forcing you to do something with it. And of course the poetic effect, and Alex talked about those yesterday, you know, that poetic effects and playing with language is important to produce an effect. But it's going to show that your experience of whether you think all sonnets are just love poems or not depends on exposure to instances. And if you come across a new instance which someone has snow-cloned or just invented for creative purposes, then that's going to extend and change your mesoconstructions. You're going to go like, oh, you can also write sonnets about stuff which isn't love. Okay? But it's experientially based, and this is sort of how we think people acquire a notion of genre. And this is how you acquire a notion of poems, and this is how you acquire a notion of novels. Okay, depending on what kind of novels you read. If Jane Austen is your thing, okay, I wouldn't know. Alex and I, we don't like Jane Austen. But I mean, if you do, brilliant, then that's going to shape your idea of what this novel is kind of like, and the participants and how they interact. Very schematic, because obviously she wrote about different stories, but common lines, and again, a kind of romantic theme. So specific Shakespeare, okay, if we do go back, specific Shakespearean sonnets, 1800, 16, whatever, would lead to an idea of what a Shakespearean sonnet looks like, which is an abstraction over it, a mesoconstruction. And if you've got Spenser and Owen and so on, then you might get to something like sonnet. And if you've got haikus and other types of things, you know, oh, it's another kind of art form. Once we get to the notion of what a poem is in terms of constructions, again, it would be very hard to give it a form, right? Because so many modern poems or haikus are different from other elements. So perhaps that's just an association like macroconstructions, similarities of mesoconstructions and not an independent node in the hierarchy. But that's a different question. We assume same kind of way, bottom up from micro to meso to macro in terms of genre. And that's why we think where construction grammar, if you take it off the football pitch, might also have something to say. So, cognitive social linguistics beyond the sentence. I'm probably doing that so good. So we had football chances for meaning pairings of different levels of abstractions and granularity, acquired in a usage-based way, which is cool because most other genres, like writing a letter, you get educational training on this. It leads to exactly the same kind of taxonomic networks that we observed for other types of linguistic structure. And we see inter-individual differences. That's what usage and exemplar-based views would also argue. If you're going to all of the football games, you're going to have a greater repertoire. If you only go like once every season, you're not going to have as much exposure. Okay. And as I said, all of the football chants, despite the fact that I did it first, and Alex was highly skeptical when I first suggested, he said, I'm not interested in football. But, you know, the longer we thought about it, we thought it's really got sort of so many extensions and so many other areas that are interesting that we feel it's a good starting point to go to take construction grammar way beyond sentences into the realm of cognition and poetics. Okay, conclusion. Variation is a variation of constructions of various sorts. Cognitive social linguistics, as a view, would say that you still need to think about the domain general cognitive principles, and frequency is still important. Okay, a type and token frequency for each specific setting. And of course, what goes on in the individual head is going to be shaped by cognitive processes like easier before difficult stuff, that you've got iconicity, all of these things. Metaphor, metonymy, all of those things are going to play a role because construction grammar says that's it, no universal grammar, just general cognitive principles of generalization and so on. On top of that, however, it opens our mind to social cognition. Because the football chants were not only a stepping stone to cognition and poetics, but they are obviously also something which show you language in use is also about linguistic identity. Okay? And as I said, it's the same for the football chants, where we can clearly see that people are wearing a football shirt and they're saying, I'm a member of Bayern Munich. Okay? And it's the same with the indexicality of social linguistic variables from pronouncing your R's or not, or having velar nasals instead of alveolar nasals in singing or singin. In Trudgill study, the same thing. Okay? Social indexicality is going to be a very important part of the constructions. Yeah, so type frequency, token frequency, analogy generalization is still important, but the social issue, and if you work on new varieties of English, that's really crucial. even on top of the dynamic model, okay? Because for in each of these countries, English is only going to be used in certain domains. And different people will also use it to a different degree, which is when the corpus-based studies become a bit more tricky. Because if for some people in Singapore, Hong Kong, or Kenya, they might bring up their kids speaking Singaporean English, okay, as a first language. Still a minority, but people are doing that. And for them, it's going to be the use, the familiar language at home, so for all of the domains, interaction between parents and kids and siblings, as well as education and formal settings. And that means that their language is going to develop in a different kind of way and has got a different status to them and a different emotional function than something which is only acquired in education. And that's why the linguistic acts of identity, what does language express and constructions express about which group you want to be a part of subconsciously. Okay? In Penny Eckert study, if you're a jock or a burnout, or if you're upper middle class or lower middle class, all of those things will be expressed by construction. Indexicality is the thing that I look at. And of course, types of contact. Because we saw in the dynamic model, short-lived context, more reliance on cognitive principles, metaphor, metonymy, those kind of things. Simple, analytic form-meaning pairings. Whereas with more extensive contact, you get more innovations on the mesoconstructional level and schematization. Okay. And if Alex and I are, well, I'm not going to say right, but if we're on the right track, then it's got extensions, okay? Then construction grammar shouldn't just stop at social linguistics, which is a huge achievement, and not a lot has been done on that. If you want to do work on that, go forth and multiply, lots of work to be done, okay? Before we can say that things are out there. But Alex and I, we've always been toying with, can we take it even further, okay? There might be boundaries, but we talk to people in musicology, and of course in music you get forms, notes, tunes, and you don't get semantic meaning, okay? There is no tune, if you've got certain notes and you associate them, they're not going to have a conventional arbitrary meaning like that e, p, and l. Apple has an association of the meaning of the concept of an apple. So da, di, da doesn't have that. Doesn't mean concept of an apple, and it doesn't mean happy, and it doesn't mean those sort of things. But what we get in music is very often that certain phrases, da 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 da, okay, have a certain meaning. Or that because it's not semantic, because it's not conventional in a society, but individuals are going to associate meanings with songs. Your favorite songs mean something to you, and if you're married, you will have certain songs that you're going to associate with specific situations. There's going to be a couple's song, okay? That's going to be very important for your relationship. That's not conventional as in spreading across people, but it goes in the same kind of way. You've got a form and you associate a meaning with it. You constructionalize it, even though you don't change the form bit. So Traugott wouldn't call it constructionalization, but you turn it into a construction. Let's use that term. And we think there's lots more to be said about that. That's an interesting concept, and if, well, can we say it? I mean, the one project that we've got in the drawer, that would be constructions as the unit of cognition. Okay? Form meaning pairings that we as humans, we associate, we try. It's like you look at a cloud and you see an animal. Okay? Effort after meaning. We've got this tendency to associate with any kind of shape. We think there's cause and effect, you know, and we think that certain shapes resemble things. That's how we sort of tick. And at the end of the day, the one book that we would like to write, or the one project that we will pursue, is how far can we take it? Is it the unit of cognition, the theory to end all theories? But this is I mean, despite the fact that we're 10 minutes, and we've got 10 minutes for a question, but this is definitely, you know, now we are in the realm of soothsaying and astrology, sort of. We're leaving the solid ground of science, which is a good point to end here. So as I said, hopefully we can move there, but social linguistics and new varieties and everything I talked about, more solid ground, definitely important. Okay. Thank you very much. Any questions?
It's a general question, thinking about syntax, because I do syntax. How would you fit in something new, and if it is idiolect in the story of the construction grammar, did you need a specific construction schema, and then it develops and it spreads to other people? So I'm thinking, the feature I've got in mind is the progressive passive things like the house is being built. There was already another construction, the passival. The house is built. So once you've got, the story goes, according to David, and that you've got a new construction in a specific group of people, the literary people like Coleridge, and then they start using it. So that's once it's new, you've got a new schema for that. That thinking of the phonology, the form, and the meaning, and then it spreads. So do you make up a new theme for something new?
Sorry, last.
You make up, or you create, you develop a new schema for new construction, and then that one wins, and we forget about the other one?
That taps into something that Alex was talking about, actualization, and the emergence of constructions in who started it, how did it spread. And with the spread, of course, the Milroys and the networks are important, work that Alex has also been doing, where you can clearly see that, you know, some people are innovators, and that's the interesting question, who are the innovators, who started it and why? And with the progressive... Past passive progressive? No. Progressive passives.
Progressive passive.
So with those, someone must have started it. Okay? And there is the interesting question of why did they start? And I would argue, I'm probably alone here, I'm not sure about Alex, I've also think that the constructicum of an individual at one point in time, in a very structuralist kind of view, gives you a network of constructions. And this will also be the locus of analogization. That something is created analogically. As we said, you need to detect the similarity between things, but in order then to create something, you need to act based on this analogy. And for me, a crucial role plays looking at what's the constructicon as a whole looking like. How does it fit into the semantic map, and how does it fit into other structures that are similar? Now with the progressive passives, obviously you also had already progressives as a structural alternative, and you had ordinary passives. And you had simple active progressives, and you've got all these other alternatives. So in a long structuralist kind of ways, and that's almost like lexical gaps, you know, that you could identify. You could see that something is potentially emerging there. It is not a predictive theory. Okay? I, at the time, couldn't have predicted that these people are going to do it, but I think that's going to play a huge role. You know, the overall network of constructions and what other pockets are out there. Just about something that I know a bit better, the comparative correlatives, for example. In English, have got an alternative with where you turn around cause and effect. So you have the standard ones, the more you eat, the fatter you get, cause, effect. Or you have, you get the fatter, the more you eat. Slightly different word order, but now the effect comes first, and then you give the cause. If you look at Old English, if you think about this from a cognition point of view, obviously cause before effect is easier to process. And if you look at modern corpora, the more you eat, the fatter you get, cause effect, way more frequent than you get the fatter the more you eat, by 100 to 1. In Old English, you only had the you get the fatter the more you eat. You didn't have the simpler structure. And there again, it was the system, the constructicon, that even led to this structure, the way that I hypothesize it, because the data is, that's before we got any textual evidence. But what you've got is, you've got things like just the C2 clause. This is the more interesting. Things like this is even more interesting, and they exist. And then you get things like main clause followed by subordinate clause. I get the stronger, though my heart is weakened. Okay? So the second part, though my heart is weakened, is not comparative, but it's a subordinate clause, and then you've got the structure main clause, subordinate clause. And the first one at least has the comparative, the second one hasn't. And then you move on and you see the development of you get the fatter the more you eat. So then you've got this. Already at the time you've got sois. Okay? And for sois, if you have a comparative element, then you have so the more you eat, sois the more you eat, sois the fatter you get. So there you have the iconic order as a possibility. So you've got a structural template, which isn't always comparative, the sois, but if it is comparative, gives you C1, C2. You have other constructions where you can gradually say, oh, this C2 started out on its own, had a subordinate clause, which because of the system was usually attached at the end. And then you have a C2 main clause and subordinate clause. And then by analogy, you can see, okay, and then you get the C2, C1. And then you can see, because of the sois, oh, look, there is a structure where you could have cause before effect. So we could also turn them around. I find the story interesting for two reasons. The first reason is we can see that the less easy to process structure was first. And of course, competition, where you say the one that is easier to process should be chosen more often, only works if your system has it as an option. Same with preposition stranding, right? If some languages only strand it, some languages only pipe it. And the competition only comes into play when a language has got both. And the second is that for it to arise, interestingly, in a very structuralist kind of way, if we interpret it, the mental constructicon is there, and there's a slot that can be identified because of analogy to existing structures, and because of then processing factors, can favor a structure to arise. So there's not necessarily a processing advantage to the passive progressives, but as I said, the system in itself identifies it as a gap. But it's not something that, well, sometimes speakers might do it consciously, but it really depends more on the constructicon and the other constructions that are there. And for innovations, for real structural innovations, new macro constructions, I would argue, if it goes like that, we have to look at this. What are the other structural constructions in the semantic map? But then basically answered lots of questions that you didn't ask. But then your main question is, of course, someone has it, and that's what Alex says. Then we need to look at the spread of it. And for some people, it's not going to be part of their constructicon. And these people are going to be exposed to specific exemplars first. And then perhaps because of their structural advantage, because they've got similar constructicons where this is also missing, it might catch on because it expresses something that so far was not expressed by the structures that they have, but is supported by form and meaning similarities with ordinary progressives and ordinary passives, and then might be picked up more easily and spread. So that will be the kind of story that I would tell about this. I don't know, would you add anything, Alex?
Yeah, of course that's right about the structure. It's not just Yale. But you also need to include the social factors. So that, spread also then depends. Spread then also depends, of course, on social factors and prestige and who does it and is it a central member. So if you can include that too, that's absolutely right, of course.
Exactly, the entire network thing.
Yeah.
We'll keep you busy.
So thinking of that construction that it was new, used by somebody in particular, and then it spread. At the synchronical level, and thinking of variation across varieties like Singapore and things. If you've got a template for the ditransities, for example, that I know about that, and you've got a variety where there is a particular group of people who make the ditransitive differently, how does it fit in the template of the ditransitives? Do you consider it exception or variation? So thinking of them, I'm thinking of the visual representation of the construction where you've got the form and the meaning. Does it fit, and then you say they do it differently and then you try to account why? Or do you present a different representation, different visual representation?
In order to answer this fully, one would have to look at the behavior of the individual. So if in a corpus you get one token from one person and they express a ditransitive without expressing the recipient in Indian English, it's impossible to say whether they also don't have a double object structure which expresses the recipient in their constructicon. If we generalize, as we do in corpus linguistics, then we see that yes, in Indian English you also get it. Okay? We have to be careful whether they're not all going to have the same representation, but we would assume that if in this society all the options are used, all of them are available, but just in the sense where we usually talked about passive vocabulary, okay? That there are things which you store passively, and you can process when other people say it, but your preferred choice in usage might be one of the other options. So both of the structures will be available to an individual, but whether an individual uses one or the other more frequently might also depend on, on their individual preferences, but in the kind of second language context of many of these post-colonial varieties, also on education, you know, and a bit of an orientation towards British English. Because some people will know that that's not a very British way of saying it, and then they might sort of exaggerate and try to use just this one structure because, and you get this in many of the nativized varieties. If you ask people what variety they speak in, I've got a good colleague from Cameroon, he says they speak with an RP accent, with a British English accent, and they don't. Okay? But that's the one that they aspire to. That's the norm that's also partly expressed in the endonormative thing. That's the kind of standard that they think they should aspire to. Okay? And these are conscious factors, but there's also going to influence your usage, right? If you monitor that, if you're aware of your second language status, but you don't want to be identified as a local Indian English speaker, because in the Indian English context, that again is going to have repercussions, you know? Are you going to sound very local? Or do you want to be part of a stratum that is more upper class, more educated, and does exactly not use those structures which are locally perhaps prominent? Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And what happens then with misapprehensions and malapropisms in the process of, you know, of consolidating a new schema? Suddenly you just realize that a group of speakers has just misunderstood one term or is pronouncing it in one particular way that is going to lead to confusion. I mean, I was thinking a little bit when we were talking about the social factors and about the frequency. And then I was, of course, definitely thinking about this when we were talking about the literature. Because you know that one important factor is, you know, the notion both in literature and also in the acquisition of new vocabulary, new expressions, and so on. I mean, when you just get something wrong. I mean, and how would you account for that in a bottom-up process?
Some of these, if we think of asparagus and sparrowgrass, you know, again, a tendency for effort after meaning. You know, you don't quite get it, that it's just a full form that you've got to store, but you assume, I'm going to make this meaningful in some sort. Many of these work that way. And then I would assume that you just sort of, it depends again on the propagation in a society. If it's someone doing it over and over again, it might catch on.
Yeah, but I mean, it's really not a big problem, I think, for this kind of theory, because it's what we find in lexicalization and then also in constructionalization. The Folketymologies are a very, very common source there, for instance, when you look at vocabulary. And as long as they are motivated, I think we can explain why many people go the same way, right? So it's not like one person analyzes it like this, the next person analyzes it like that, because there's some kind of a conceptual blending, metaphorical basis for many of these folk etymologies. So, and then of course it needs to catch on, and yeah, sometimes it does, sometimes not.
What about low frequency? Okay. What about low frequency phenomenon? For instance, my construction is not very frequent, and I'm trying to trace its development, and I found very scattered examples all over the place, and I don't see a clear connection between them. I actually see very idiosyncratic, a very idiosyncratic use of the construction. So, do you know any articles that deal with this kind of constructions that could help me to, in a way, see how the construction could have developed, or? Yeah. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I know what Alex is going to say. I always know what you're going to say. We're in sync. But Lena Heine and he had already looked.
That's what I wanted to say.
There you go. Surprisingly, at a service offer construction. So if in a situation, you know, you're on an airplane and the flight attendant comes around and he asks, newspaper? Coffee, you know, just a noun phrase, and you know in the situation he or she is offering me something and they want to know whether I want it. Extremely low frequent. Which corpus did Lena look at?
All of them.
All of them, yeah. And you hardly ever find it. And yet, I mean, first of all, the issue is we all know that it works. We've all heard it and we can do something with it, even if it's not very frequent. And you want to tell the David story?
Yeah, I mean, when Lena searched for that in the corpora, and she really looked through millions and millions of words, and all she found was food, drugs, and medical drugs, right? So people saying coffee, that was the most common thing, and aspirin, and, I don't know, Coke. So these were the examples that she found. And at first, she had the hypothesis based on her data, which was sort of statistically solid, that that's a construction that you use for offering food, drugs, and medicine. And then she was on a plane to New Zealand, and she had the flight attendant come there saying, towel. She's like, shit. And then she thought, okay, there's more to it. And then, of course, as a near-native speaker, you think, yeah, of course I can do that with other stuff. And then she gave a talk at a conference in, I think it was Isle 1 in Freiburg. And after the talk, David Dennison came up to her and said, handout. And the bottom line is that this is, in the corpora, this is an extremely infrequent, very, very rare construction. And the hypothesis that you derive from the corpora is very wrong when you look at real life, because we all know, and we all do it, towel, handout, coffee, and so on and so forth. So even if you find these very infrequent things, maybe there's a pattern behind it that you have to find through, well, speaker intuition maybe, something like that.
And several things can be.
One could be the corpus is just an adequate representation of the kind of data that you need. Maybe not enough service encounters in the electronic corpora. But another thing is, and that's important, is we've been discussing the question of how frequent does something have to be part of your constructed thing. I mean, if you think back to the Goldberg experiment, it was artificial, but they've only seen something like 6 to 12 instances, right? 12 different lexicalizations in a very short amount of time. Maybe that's enough for people to say, maybe that's something creative. If you've got like a form meaning correspondence and you've got the setting and you...
Okay, I'm on a low battery. I'm running out. Okay, so that I mean, the first thing is it just couldn't pop up in the corpora because the corpora are not the adequate representation. You might find them elsewhere, or it could be that little input with sufficient type frequency could also lead to schematization, which would go a bit against about language acquisition, where kids are usually very conservative, but maybe adult speakers are more comfortable doing it. That's one possibility. And it could be that perhaps these few little instances, if it's like on a semantic map, again, something like a good gap in something that you need and that fits a bill, perhaps it's also one that gets snow cloned. I mean, ever since you talked about it again yesterday, I thought maybe there are more instances of snow clones, not necessarily based on a vast variety of different types, but maybe 2 or 3, and you go like, oh, so it's interesting, I could do that.
And I mean, this is something we need to test empirically. Maybe it is just one. I mean, you hear this one really funky, nice pattern once, and you start playing around with it. Or maybe somebody asked the question, errors, right? You hear it once, and you replicate it, and you just get it wrong. You twist it because of performance, right? Think about the sharpest tool in the shed, okay? Right. And then you hear the sharpest tool in the shed, and there was something about sharp or something. You think, what else is sharp? Well, it's a knife is sharp. So, and where's the knife? It's not in the shed. Well, so it has to be sharpest knife in the drawer. And all of a sudden, just by not memorizing it correctly, you come up with the second microconstruction. And then, of course, people perceive these two, and, well, schematization. So it could even start with one single element. So, but we need to look at your data later on anyway. Yep.
Definitely best, but be prepared. We want to talk about you, okay? So be prepared to talk about a little bit about your data and what you think is problematic, or what you think you've gleaned from what we've done so far. Where you said, I think from what you said, I would approach it from a construction grammar point of view like this or that. Or we say, I still don't see it. I don't know what you're on about. Doesn't help me. Okay? Okay. Have a nice lunch. See you later.